Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and it's our first Friday night show in the general election campaign. Aaron, very excited to have you with me this evening.
I'm very excited. We've got a very exciting 6 weeks ahead. We've got the European Championships. We've got a general election, and we've got 6 episodes of our lovely tete-a-tetes on Friday night. Look forward to all of it.
I know which one of those I find most exciting. Coming up later tonight, Keir Starmer faces his first broadcast grilling of the general election campaign. Jeremy Corbyn has made his pitch to continue to be the Member of Parliament for Islington North. And we look at I think we can say, pretty shoddy performance from Labour's Shadow Education Secretary on BBC Question Time. It wasn't necessarily her fault. It's because Labour still don't seem to want to commit to anything 6 weeks out from a general election. Quite a Labour focus today. It's been the Labour Party more sort of in the media, in the news over the past 24 hours than the Conservatives. The International Court of Justice has ruled that Israel must cease its offensive in Rafah. The World Court delivered the judgment this afternoon, and it was in response to a request from South Africa to update the provisional measures that the ICJ ordered in January.
The court considered that, in conformity with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, Israel must immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, in order to preserve evidence related to allegations of acts falling within the scope of Article 2 and Article 3 of the Genocide Convention. Israel must take effective measures to ensure the unimpeded access to the Gaza Strip of any commission of inquiry, fact-finding mission, or other investigative body mandated by competent organs of the United Nations to investigate allegations of genocide. The court considered that Israel must submit a report to the court on all measures taken to give effect to this order within 1 month from the date of this order. The report so provided will then be communicated to South Africa, which shall be given the opportunity to submit to the court its comments thereon.
So the key orders were for Israel to cease hostilities in Rafah, which may bring about the destruction of the Palestinian people in whole or in part, to allow a fact-finding mission into Gaza, and to submit a report to the ICJ within 1 month to demonstrate that Israel has been following the orders delivered by the ICJ. The judges on the court voted for all of those measures by a margin of 13-2. What does it all mean? Well, earlier today, I spoke to Alonso Gourmendi, lecturer in international relations at King's College London and an expert on international law. I began by asking him to explain how the court came to this decision.
For the court to arrive at this decision, they needed to show that the Rafah offensive was a new set of facts that had changed the circumstances enough so that the original orders were not sufficient to address what was going on the ground. This is essentially what the court does in most of the opinion. And it concludes that, the circumstances are different and something else needs to be done. And it proposes essentially 2 very big changes in the dynamic of this conflict. The first one is it orders Israel to halt its Rafah offensive and any other action that may create conditions on the ground that would lead towards the destruction of Palestinians. And second of all, it orders it to allow investigative commissions into Gaza, which is something that has not happened before, and we were told in the beginning were not needed. So it is a big change in circumstances. It's a change in the orders. There is debate about what this order actually does and says, and we can talk about that. But in a nutshell, that's what's happening.
I want to talk about that ambiguity. These rulings often come with lots of it. And I suppose I'll read in full sort of the quote of what they agreed. So they said, Israel should immediately halt its military offensive and any other action in the Rafah governorate which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that could bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. And the 2 readings, as far as I understand, both of sort of external experts, but also actually the judges on the panel, the judges sitting on the ICJ. So some of them are saying this ruling means that Israel has to cease any action whatsoever in Rafah, full stop. And then others saying, well, this is just saying that any action in Rafah, which may in whole or in part destroy the Palestinian people, they can't do. So it's almost a bit like it's a repetition, I think, of what we heard in that case in January, where some people said, oh, well, it's saying that you can't attack or kill Palestinians. And then people said, no, they can only not attack or kill Palestinians if it is done to destroy the Palestinian people in whole or in part. Could you sort of explain those ambiguities and I suppose the implications that these different readings have?
I read it the way you do. I think what the order says is the Rafah offensive should end. Actions should be halted, period. And then if there are any other actions that also contribute to creating conditions of life that might lead to the destruction of Palestinians, then those should also stop. That's, I think, the ordinary reading for me. The problem is that we have the two dissenting judges, Sebutinde and Barak, so judges that did not vote for this order, reading it in this restrictive way of saying, no, it is an order that only prevents or makes Israel halt its operation to the degree that it creates those conditions. So Israel can continue with its operation with a proviso. You have those two judges that it wouldn't matter if they were the only two judges that said so, because they would be the dissenting judges. So the judges that did not agree with the majority. The bigger problem is that there's two judges, Aurescu and Nolte, that also seem to read the opinion in that way in their declarations, their appended declarations to the main order. The main problem being that while I read this in its plain reading as you do, no other judge said so. We have Judge Tladi of South Africa saying that the offensive should end, meaning that defensive action can still proceed, but the offensive itself should end, and that's it. There's no other judge that has said, oh, I read it as stop the offensive, period. And this creates leeway, room, space for supporters of Israel and Israel itself to argue, well, I can still continue with my operations because there's four judges that said so. It would have been beneficial for the court to have more judges appending decisions on how they read this text. And honestly, it would have been even better if the court could have just written a clear text. The problem is that this order, 13 versus 2, I mean, it sounds great, 13 votes in favor, 2 against. I think the reason that they got to 13 is because of this obscure writing. And that's probably what explains it. I guess it is regrettable. I would have preferred an 11-4, clearly written, than a 13-2 with ambiguity.
If we've got a somewhat ambiguous ruling, I mean, what significance does this have? I mean, we already know the International Court of Justice doesn't have any enforcement powers. They've now delivered a judgment that can be read in more than one way. You know, obviously, when this was first announced, I think there was lots of sort of relief and even elation sort of among people who are sick of seeing Israel conduct what many see as a genocidal war against the Palestinian people. But, you know, it's one of those situations where as the details come out, you're sort of left thinking, well, has anything really changed?
Look, at the end of the day, legal texts need to be interpreted in a specific way. There is technique in how to interpret legal texts. And one of the main rules is that you need to interpret legal texts in their ordinary sense, in their ordinary meaning, taking into consideration the object and purpose of the text. And so I think there is enough here to say that the order does order, at least, even if we have disagreement on the entire breadth of things that it bans, it clearly bans things. It clearly says that military operations in Rafah need to stop. Some say completely, some say in a specific and limited way. I would argue that the plain reading would be the most expansive one, that the offensive has to stop. But whatever the disagreement, it is still the International Court of Justice saying that there is a plausible risk of right under the Genocide Convention being affected. So if you add to this the ICC, if you add to these all the video evidence of Israeli soldiers violating the rules of war in Gaza, you keep stacking these things. It becomes increasingly quite frankly, in my opinion, almost impossible to argue that it is legal to sell weapons to Israel at this point. No matter how you read this opinion, no matter if you read it expansively or restrictively, the result is the same. There is a serious risk of violating conventional rights under the Genocide Convention. And so that should be enough. So that is a big change, I guess, in the dynamic by the court. And then the other massive change is the order that the provisional measure that requires Israel to grant access to investigative commissions. There's also debate as to what is covered in it, but it would grant access to either specific commissions created by the General Assembly or to, say, the Special Rapporteur on Israel-Palestine, and potentially the ICC eventually, not directly because the ICC is not UN mandated, but that is also a huge turn of events if pressure increases. So what's going to happen now is that since Israel is probably going to find ways to not comply with the order, we're going to end up in the Security Council again, and the United States is going to again have to spend political capital in vetoing a resolution. But that tires things out. Political capital is not infinite, especially in an election year in the United States. So yes, it's not ideal, but it probably has more to do with the court wanting to generate consensus than the court, boycotting procedures or anything like that.
Has there ever been a sort of state this close to the West that has sort of suffered so many legal reprimands, let's say, first in sort of the International Criminal Court and now in the International Court of Justice? Are we somewhat in new territory, as it were, where you've got a state which sort of looks like a pariah nation, but is an ally of the United States? Obviously, we've seen this with African states. We've seen this with Russia, and then sort of the quote-unquote international community sort of says these people need to be isolated. But it does feel like new territory where a country which is sort of really at the center, actually, of the Western alliance is finding itself reprimanded by so many different international courts and institutions.
Look, when I was in law school, the big international legal debate was universal jurisdiction, about how states could pass laws to prosecute gross human rights violators, war criminals, people who commit crimes against humanity in their own courts, no matter how many links they had to those countries. So Belgium, for example, had a very ambitious universal jurisdiction law. And eventually Donald Rumsfeld found himself accused in Belgium. What usually happened in those scenarios was the United States picked up the phone and said, this law is inconvenient. So in that specific case, they said, look, do you want the NATO headquarters to stay in Belgium? Yes? Okay, then this law has to go. And so the law was watered down. And global South states had no real power to face the West in this way through legal mechanisms. So usually enforcement mechanisms took more indirect action. This is changing because the balance of power in the world is changing. And so now South Africa can take this measure, and really there's nothing that the West can do to stop it. And so, yes, it is a new situation. There has been situations where Western states have been taken to the International Court of Justice before. NATO was famously taken to the International Court of Justice in the context of the operations against Kosovo, the United States by Nicaragua. But the repeated nature of the orders and what Judge Sebutinde calls the micromanagement of hostilities by the court, that is new. That is new ground. And I think, despite what Israel might say, I think that's good. I think the more lawful and legal oversight over a conflict, the better for international law. So I'm happy with it. I know Israel isn't, but that's how the world is turning now. And I think I'm glad that there are states that are able to assume this position of rule enforcers.
Do you think these judgments are affecting facts on the ground? So, of course, we've already had sort of that provisional order from January to say there's a plausible risk that people's right to not be subject to genocide will be broken. It's somewhat convoluted, isn't it? Because there was that judge who said it's not a plausible genocide. It's plausible that their rights to not be genocided will be breached. Somewhat confusing to someone who's not within the law. Then we've also got, as I say, sort of the ICC. Have you recognized this changing, either, I suppose, the facts on the ground as to how Israel are behaving, or the decisions being made in those Western capitals that matter as to whether to sort of continue sending Israel the arms it needs to continue to conduct this offensive?
There's a slow process here. I found the German reaction to the ICC, for example, particularly illuminating, because Germany is a country that so far has been very defensive with regards to Israel's operations in Gaza. And when the ICC arrest warrant requests came in, its reaction was more of, oh, these are difficult decisions, but the court needs to make its own mind about them. And I wasn't expecting that. I thought Germany would come out similarly to the UK or the US and say these are unfounded, Israel is not doing anything wrong, period. So that was an interesting turn of events, to be honest. And I feel like this order by the court, which read it however you want, it is still an escalation of what the court has said in the past, also shows, I think, an increasing level of impatience with regards to Israel. It's as if many were I don't understand why, but I guess many in the West were expecting Israel to act differently than what it is acting in Gaza. And they were expecting that at some point there would be a pivot, at some point they would soften their approach. And it doesn't happen. And they keep investing political capital in saying, no, but Israel is doing the right thing. And so I do see exasperation. For example, in the United States' decision to suspend shippings of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel, it is not that it's a game changer on the ground because it is still sending other kinds of weapons, but it is an important sign that patience and political capital are not infinite. And so the cost of supporting Israel is increasing. And I think that is good because eventually we need to get to a position where, particularly through domestic action, particularly in countries like the US or in Germany, the idea that you can just unlimitedly sell weapons to Israel cannot sustain itself. There's an interesting quote in Judge Tladi's declaration to the court order that says something around the lines of Israel wants to portray the situation as one where the right to defend its population warrants any response, and we cannot accept that. I think that message is slowly being understood in the West in ways that were understood outside of the West months ago.
Keir Starmer has been giving his first set of TV interviews of the general election campaign, and there was a big focus on whether he is trustworthy enough. This was Keir Starmer on Sky News.
Energy is one area that you've backtracked since you became Labour leader, ditching your promise to spend £28 billion a year in green investment. It's not the only one, is it? You've also dropped pledges to abolish university tuition fees, increase income tax for the top 5% of earners, bring into public ownership the utilities. So are people right to worry that any promises you make now will be junked once you're in number 10?
Well, let me take that on head on, and thank you for putting it to me, because if you take, say, tuition fees, I do think the current system is unfair. I think it's unfair on students. I think it's unfair on universities. It needs to change. And I did advocate getting rid of tuition fees. You're absolutely right about that. Now damage has been done to the economy. We've got to make a choice because we've got waiting lists that are the best part of 8 million. The money is not available to do both 40,000 appointments every week to bring the waiting list down and tuition fees.
Okay.
So I've had to, hear me out because I do think this is very important. In the end, if you can't do both, you have to make a decision. Are you going to abolish tuition fees or are you going to bring down the waiting lists? I've taken a political choice. I accept that. People will judge me on that. I accept that. My choice, given the level of waiting lists, is to bring those waiting lists down and put the NHS back on its feet. That means I can't abolish tuition fees.
Okay.
Now, you will say to me, well, that's a U-turn. It's the practical reality of the damage that the Tories have done to the economy. And many people watching this will know that they wanted to do many things, but when they look at the costings, they can't do all of them. They've got to make a choice. What I want to do is be clear about what that choice is and to say it this side of the election so people can judge me. Is he right to prioritise the NHS over tuition fees? If you agree with him, then that might be a reason to vote for him. If you think no, I think we can leave the NHS on its face, on its knees, but get rid of abolish tuition fees. If you think that's the right choice, well, that's a difference of opinion. I've made my choice in difficult circumstances because they've busted the economy, but it's I don't want to announce this after the election. I want people to be able to judge me. I've prioritised the NHS. That is my political choice. And people viewing this will have to decide whether I've made the right priority there. I think I have.
That was a smart but very sneaky way to answer that question, right? So he's asked you, you've gone against all of your pledges. And he says, well, look, I mean, if I've gone against my pledges, it's only because I value the NHS so much. And he's saying, look, if you think that abolishing tuition fees is more important than getting down waiting lists, so be it. But if you think that the NHS is the most important thing in this country, then all of my U-turns are suddenly justified, right? If you frame it like that, of course it was a good idea. I suppose what it ignores is that one of his U-turns was increasing taxes on the rich. Now, there is no reason in the world to believe that, the government having to have spent more money on, say, energy bills as they did, for example, or interest rates going up. None of these things can possibly be reasons why you shouldn't tax the rich more. So putting together sort of this mutually exclusive idea where you either put money towards tuition fees or you put money towards the NHS, I think is deeply disingenuous. But he's chosen a line. He'll stick to it. On Good Morning Britain, Keir Starmer was also challenged on shifts Starmer has made since he became Labour leader.
I think I've interviewed you before on this show and other members of your party, MPs, and the line from Labour about migration was safe and legal routes. That's what we want, safe and legal routes. Now there seems to be this sort of hard line, sort of anti-terror strategy about combating. What happened to, and I'll quote you again, the compassionate immigration system that you promised? What about those safe and legal routes that we used to hear from you back in 2019?
There is absolutely no progressive or compassionate argument for putting vulnerable people, the most vulnerable people sometimes in the world, in a small boat to make that dangerous crossing by a small boat over the channel.
Therefore, isn't the first thing safe and legal routes in Kabul, in Afghanistan, in Syria? A lot of UN and the UN and the refugee agencies are saying those safe routes don't exist, and that's why they head for the boats.
Just let me, I really want to nail this because I absolutely do not accept with any fibre of my body that there is anything moral or courageous or compassionate or progressive about putting people in a boat to cross the channel that risks their lives and breaches our borders. Now, of course, when we had the terrible situation in Afghanistan just a year or two ago with the Taliban coming in, we had to provide a route for those Afghans who had helped us in particular. Some of them, for example, interpreting for our troops, helping our troops. We wanted to make a route for them, and we all supported that. Equally with Ukraine, we've had the Homes for Ukraine refugee schemes, and we all supported that. I think they're absolutely clear-cut examples. But I will come back to this because I'll take anyone on this. There is no compassionate liberal case for arguing that you should put people in boats to go across the channel in those dangerous conditions.
Now, again, that was an incredibly disingenuous argument. I don't think anyone in the world is suggesting that there's a compassionate case for putting people into dangerous boats and crossing the channel. He was asked about safe routes. Now, the idea of safe routes, I don't actually think it would stop channel crossings necessarily, but that's clearly not going to increase channel crossings, and it will reduce them somewhat, I would believe, right? So some people who would have crossed the channel are going to apply in these safe routes. Some of them will get accepted, and therefore they won't try and get in boats. So the idea, it was again a very disingenuous answer, I think, although potentially politically smart, right? He doesn't want to commit to safe routes because he thinks that's something that the Tories could attack him on, but he also doesn't want to seem completely callous. So he tries to pretend that the issue is about him wanting to stop small boats. Incredibly dishonest, politically astute, or maybe people are seeing through it. In any case, Adil Ray talked there, so the GMB host, talked in that clip about how Labour used to talk about safe and legal routes. Now, I had that memory in my mind, but I wanted to go back and find the evidence, and it does exist. So this was Shadow Immigration Minister Stephen Kinnock talking about Labour's asylum plans in March last year.
Let's talk about your potential plans to create these return deals. With who and how are you going to create returns deals?
So we need a returns deal with the European Union. Of course, the most important countries there are the so-called Calais group along the coastline, France, Belgium, etc. That deal needs to be, of course, where the UK puts an offer on the table around how many asylum seekers we should take. In return, the European Union accepts that people who come on small boats should be returned. And of course, that's the way to break the people smugglers, because nobody's going to pay £5,000 or £10,000 to a people smuggler when they know that when they arrive in the UK, they'll be returned to continental Europe. We then need upstream processing, working with our European partners and allies, getting a strategy across Europe to address this issue so that we take our fair share, other European Union countries do the same. And that is the way that we will smash the people smugglers, stop people taking these extremely dangerous journeys. And of course, added to that, we need that clear line on safe and legal routes.
So now we're not just talking about pledges that Keir Starmer made in his leadership election, right? Keir Starmer was the leader of the Labour Party then, been leader for 4 years. And Labour's position on asylum seekers then, or small boats then, was to say we're going to have to agree with the European Union that we will take a certain number of asylum seekers arriving in Europe. And in exchange, they'll give us a returns agreement whereby if anyone crosses the channel, we can send them back to continental Europe. And then he says, in addition to that, we will sort out some safe routes. And, we get closer to an election, suddenly Keir Starmer realised that made them electorally vulnerable because the Tories can say they want to accept, X number of migrants from the European Union. And now we have a policy which I don't think will particularly work, just all focused on we'll get the security services involved to try and stop people setting boats off a coast, which I think is sort of over 100 kilometres long. We did an episode on this, sort of the details of why this won't necessarily work, Labour's current position. Aaron, though, these sort of issues about trust and sort of pledges and Keir Starmer breaking his promises, they are things that the left have been talking about for a long time now. Some might say obsessively, him breaking all of these pledges. I have been thinking that, they're probably not going to be that damaging to him. Having lied to Labour Party members is probably a somewhat low salience issue. But the media really do seem to be sort of, in all of his interviews this morning, that just kept getting put to Keir Starmer. Can we trust you? You've broken your promises. Do you think this matters?
Of course it matters. I mean, fortunately for Keir Starmer, the Conservatives are down and out, but I do think it'll have an impact on turnout. I do think it'll have an impact on Labour's majority. And I think it'll have an impact on how the media treats any potential Starmer government after July the 4th. It's massive. And I think the real downsides will be in any re-election efforts and that sort of political period, that 5 years after 2024. Because, of course, if he does change course, there is a ready-made, off-the-shelf line of attack against him. A few things, Michael. So he said the waiting lists are too high. I've had to change course. NHS waiting lists in 2020, when he made that promise, were 4.2 million. They had doubled since 2012. So NHS waiting lists were at all-time highs. Well, in recent decades, in 2020, but apparently now they're so high that you can't do anything. They were already very high. So again, it's fundamentally misleading what he's saying there. And I'd also say that the issue of inadequate recruitment for the NHS is directly connected to the issue of student debt. They're not two separate things. When you have nurses graduating with, on average, around £50,000 worth of student debt, we're now changing the terms of those student loans, or we have changed the terms of those student loans. So actually, the repayment period is longer. That disadvantages women. Why? Because they tend to take time out of the labour market to have children. So they actually pay longer. They're being discriminated against as women. Crazy, but true. They're not two distinct issues. I don't think we should have tuition fees. I think they should be scrapped. And I would bring back maintenance grants. But I think a perfectly centrist sort of triangulating position for someone like Keir Starmer, trying to be just popular, would be to scrap them for things like nurses and midwives, right? Surely. But no, apparently these are two separate things. On the issue of migration, refugees, Michael, this was Mr. Free Movement. Mr. Free Movement. Mr. Stop Brexit. And now he's presenting himself as something very different. On the point of safe routes to the UK, you were framing it there as an issue of political expediency. And would it reduce the numbers of people getting in small boats? It probably would marginally, but it wouldn't stop it. There's also, of course, the issue of, is it the right thing to do? And I think, of course, it's the right thing to do. I know you think that too, but it wasn't said out loud. If you look at, for instance, Afghanistan, many people there don't want to be there. They are in trouble. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, Britain, couldn't accept the entirety of Afghanistan coming here, but you should have safe routes, easy to access for discriminating against minorities, Hazara. If there's a prominent female teacher who's being discriminated against or is being intimidated, LGBT people, LGBT activists, all kinds of people. There should be a safe route for those people to get access to asylum in the UK. It shouldn't be. They have to cross 5,000, 6,000 miles, whatever it is. I've said on the record previously that we should have rapprochement with Iran, that Britain should have a diplomatic presence in Iran, obviously in Afghanistan too. We don't right now because of the Taliban, and that people can seek safe routes via those two countries. I'd say the same with Iraq, although it's a much safer country than Afghanistan. I think really there's a very strong case for doing this with regards to Afghanistan. And some other places too. You know, if Syria, there is the example of a very prominent, Free Syria activist, and they can demonstrate that their lives are in danger, then of course they should be given asylum. So we should have those safe routes, irregardless of what it does to the small boats issue. Like I say, particularly I think with Afghanistan, more so because we have that historic debt of going to that country, being there for 20 years, killing a bunch of people, by the way, but also telling many, many people you can perform certain roles in public life and in civil society, including working with us, and there'll be no downside to that. But of course, we've then left and people are now fearing for their lives in the case of people that worked with the UK and US armies or the other groups I mentioned. So I think you need the safe routes. What Starmer is trying to do there is conflate people smuggling with people trafficking. People that come on small boats from France to the UK, you can say it's not the ideal way to get here, I'd agree with that, but they're not being trafficked. And I think there is an intentional conflation there. They are coming willingly. They want to come here for a bunch of reasons, but they're not being trafficked. And this idea of them being exploited, in part, of course they're being exploited. They're paying through the nose to get on a rubber dinghy to make one of the world's most dangerous trips under certain circumstances. But they're also people that want to get here. So I think really fundamentally across all of those topics you just mentioned there, Michael, he is a very deceitful, dishonest politician, but particularly on that NHS waiting list thing, it really is just absurd. You made that promise when waiting lists were already 4.2 million. Yes, of course, they're significantly higher now, but this idea that the NHS was in a safe, sweet spot prior to the COVID crisis is obvious idiocy. He would have campaigned in 2019 for the Labour Party saying, we have to save the NHS. But now he's explicitly saying, well, actually, the NHS in 2020 was fine. Now it's screwed. This is the classic Labour tactic. The NHS was fine then, but now, this time, really, I mean it. And then finally, Michael, him backing down on things like tax cuts. This, for me, is the killer argument. You're not going to do a bunch of things which are progressive, like getting rid of the 2-child cap on benefits, for instance. You're not going to do a bunch of things like that because we don't have the money. Well, okay, I don't agree, but that would be a lot more coherent if, like you say, he hadn't backed down on things like a wealth tax, if they hadn't opposed increases to corporation tax just a couple of years ago. And also there is something to say about us spending too much money on really stupid stuff. And this is stuff I get really passionate about these days because I'm getting old. We waste so much money on police and crime commissioners. Okay, you might say, Aaron, it's only $500 million a year. Okay, well, scrap them and use that to start a bursary to pay for nurses to get university qualifications. Scrap the House of Lords or make it at least much smaller. At least make it much smaller. Okay, well, that's only going to be several $100 million a year. Okay, well, put it towards ending the 2-child benefit cap. All these commissioners and quangos, scrap them, get rid of them. Afuera, as one head case in Argentina says it, get rid of them. So the fault of Starmer really is about do-nothingism, appease any misgivings that the establishment and moneyed interests have, and try and cloak it in progressive clothing. So it really is going to be interesting to see over the next couple of years, if of course they do win after July the 4th, how many promises they're actually going to come good on. Even the one I like, bringing rail back into public ownership, is incredibly minimal because, of course, it's talking about licenses or franchises which elapse and then they bring them back in regardless. And by the way, lots of those are already owned by the public. So it's a funny one, Michael. And just in answer to your question, I think the trust issue will absolutely come to bite him on the backside. Will it stop them entering number 10 Downing Street? I don't think so.
In terms of what's changed since 2020, so Starmer would say it's not just that the NHS is in a more dire situation, it's that we've got less money, because of the Liz Truss mini budget and because of COVID-19. So, I don't think he would just say, oh, the NHS has got worse now, so we can't sort of abolish tuition fees. He's saying, given the fact that we've got less money now, I have to make tougher choices. And if I'm looking at what pledges to drop, I'm going to drop the pledge about university tuition fees as opposed to the pledge about the NHS. But we're very much agreed in terms of he could just say, okay, well, I'll tax the rich. You can't say the economic situation is bad, so therefore I'm not going to increase taxes on the top 5%. Doesn't make much sense. I want to get up some polling, which I thought was very interesting today, which shows that these trust issues aren't necessarily damaging Labour's electoral chances so far. And it's sort of looking at voting intention by age. It shows that Labour is ahead of the Tories in every age group other than people over 70. Labour's strongest age group is people in their 30s, where 60% of people support Labour, and they have more than 50% support in every age group under 50. Aaron, I mean, it's pretty overwhelming. I mean, even sort of in 2019, I think Labour Labour won a majority among sort of working age people, but now all the way up to 70, Labour are ahead. And I think kind of maybe what stuck out from me here was those younger age groups, because I think we have sort of had a narrative and we've been thinking that Labour don't seem to be offering much to young people, right? They're focusing so much of their commitments to older people in the red wall, essentially. And they seem somewhat dismissive, in fact, of sort of people who are much younger. Tuition fee pledges getting broken, climate pledges getting broken, things which younger people might tend to prioritize. They seem to be, fairly happy to drop, essentially. But you've still got a massive majority of people, 18 to 24, 57% of people supporting Labour, 25 to 29, 59% of people supporting Labour. So a solid absolute majority in those age groups. They'll be relieved to see that, won't they?
Well, they will, but also, these aren't constituency specific. I mean, that's what I think really matters when it comes to the Greens, because, of course, they're only competitive, Michael, in 3 seats at the next election. I mean, we might be surprised. The polling's very good for places like Stroud, but fundamentally, we're looking at Waveney Valley, Bristol Central, and Brighton Pavilion. So I think that's only, it's only half the story. In terms of the age groups as well, Michael, for me, looking at that, is the big story is the Tories. The Green Party amongst under 40s are doing better than the Conservative Party. And I think that will be sucker for the Greens. They will think, if we don't really screw up in the next 10 to 15 years, we should have, half a dozen MPs. We should. And that might sound, so what, for half a dozen MPs? To become a new mainstream party in British politics is extraordinarily hard. Nigel Farage tried very hard and he failed very hard. Yes, they got Brexit, but in 2015 they got 3.8 million votes, and then they got 1 seat. Doug Carswell. So that to me was what was really, really interesting with that data, Michael. And the Tories, really, they are in big, big trouble, Michael. Because look, they're not just doing badly with 18 to 24-year-olds, they're doing really badly with under 40s. And, that 30 to 39 bracket for me is fascinating, because that's the age where people start businesses, they start families, they think about getting on the housing ladder. 10% of people aged 30 to 39 are looking at the Tories. And it goes back to that story we talked about not so long ago in the FT, where actually millennials in the UK are becoming more left-wing as they age rather than more right-wing. That's the pattern. And it really is borne out here. It's not just the Tories are looking at something cyclical. We've never really seen one of the 2 major parties, averaging around 9% amongst the under 40s. I mean, that's really, really extraordinary. Of course, they've struggled amongst the young for a very long time, but not to that extent. And by the way, if you think that's not new, actually younger voters were more likely to vote Tory than Labour for most of the 1980s. The Thatcherite project was viewed as a young, virile, going somewhere, ambitious project for regular people. You might not like to hear that. Particularly in the south of England, it really was. It was a popular project, especially amongst the young. Owen Jones talks about this all the time. Back then, the idea of being a radical leftist was associated actually with being older, older 68ers. So that is a really interesting data point for me, Michael, just looking at the Lib Dems, the Greens and the Tories amongst under 40s.
Jeremy Corbyn has today announced he will stand as an independent candidate in Islington North. He's represented the constituency since 1983, and here's his pitch to continue doing so.
We've achieved some fantastic victories together, and that is what being the local MP is all about. I believe in democracy. I want our political parties to be democratic, but members of Islington North Labour have been denied the right to choose their own candidate, and alongside that, the community as a whole has been disempowered because of that. So we have to stand up. We have to stand up and say, we're not taking this anymore. We will assert our rights. That's why I'm standing to be an independent candidate for the people of Islington North. This country has become more divided than ever. There are more people living in desperate poverty than I've ever known. There are more people using food banks and more families wondering how on earth they can make ends meet. Young people who can't get anywhere to live, people with children living in a very overcrowded place, people in the private rented sector facing high rents and insecurity. We're not going to end any of this without fundamental change, fundamental redistribution of power and of wealth, public ownership of water, mail, energy companies. Other countries manage to control rent and control the private rented sector. Why can't we? A health service that isn't the plaything of global corporations trying to take it over, but is our health service for us. These fundamental demands are not being presented by the official opposition at the moment. Yet they are the demands of millions of people all over the country.
So the full video is about 3 minutes long, so slightly longer. He sort of talks about the victories he's had in his constituency. Then he's obviously talking about the undemocratic nature of his inability to stand as a Labour MP. And we're then talking about how sort of he'll be arguing for more transformative policies in Parliament if he is elected. And of course, the inevitable response to Corbyn standing as an independent was his expulsion from the Labour Party. You get an automatic expulsion if you stand against a Labour candidate or support someone who stands against a Labour candidate. And Novara Media's Moyat Lothian-McLean got Jeremy Corbyn's reaction today.
This obviously means that you've been expelled from the party that you've been a lifelong member of. How are you feeling about that?
Well, I feel very sad. I joined the Labour Party when I was 17 years old, and I've held within the Labour Party every position there is to hold, from being a street collector in the days when people paid their subscriptions by cash, to being branch secretary, branch chair, constituency agent, regional executive member, member of parliament, and leader of the party. I've held every single position there is. And this morning, a few minutes after I made the announcement, I got a short formal letter saying, you're no longer a member of the Labour Party.
So it was ready and waiting to go, you think?
Clearly somebody came in early to make sure it happened.
The rest of that interview with Corbyn will be on our channel later this weekend, so do look out for that. Aaron, this is a surprise to absolutely no one. I mean, I think everyone's been aware. Corbyn's pretty much made it clear that he will be standing in Islington North. Everyone now is going to be asking the question, can he win? Can he win it?
He certainly can win it. And I actually think, Michael, Labour have fast-tracked their candidate now. There will be no hustings. There will be no anonymous voter voting. Although is that really voting? Who knows? There's some big questions around anonymous voter. So, I mean, it was surprising so much as the general election was a surprise, and the Labour Party thought that they had time to do their online hustings and whatnot. But what's interesting for me, Michael, with Labour and the candidates they had, they shortlisted two candidates. I think one was a councillor, one is a member of the London Assembly. There were no big hitters. Mary Cray was being, touted at one point. Former Labour MPs who may have lost in 2019, or MEPs, people who were close to the Labour establishment, so to speak. They weren't being touted, they weren't involved. And I find that really interesting. And I suspect it indicates a general concern that they might not win. It might be quite close. And actually, if you don't win, it's a poison chalice and you'll be remembered forever as the person that lost Jeremy Corbyn, who stood as an independent. So, look, it's not over. Corbyn has to go out and win it. But the idea that it's a dead cert for Labour, I think, is nonsensical. And you know that just by looking at the candidates who were shortlisted.
Let's go on to another Labour left politician, or someone who is still a Labour politician, who currently doesn't hold the party whip, although is still a party member. Of course, we're talking about Diane Abbott. Keir Starmer was asked today whether she will be allowed to stand as a Labour candidate.
The final decisions on candidates is coming up in a few days' time, I think June the 4th. It may be a little earlier, a little later, I can't quite remember. But within a relatively short period of time, the final list of candidates will be decided, and that'll be a matter for the Labour Party's National Executive Committee.
If she's not a candidate, how comfortable are you that Natalie Elphicke will be a Labour candidate and not Diane Abbott?
Natalie Elphicke won't be a Labour candidate. She's standing down at this election. We have an excellent candidate in Dover.
So Keir Starmer there still not willing to commit to what will happen with Diane Abbott. Now, you might think if they're leaving it to, because I think the line today is that the decision will be made about Diane Abbott on the final day where you can apply to be an MP. The deadline for the Labour Party deciding who will be standing in each candidate. Is it the application or the deadline for deciding? I'm not sure. But having such a tight schedule does make it seem like potentially they are going to give her the whip back, because otherwise they'd have to sort of decide on the same day who will be the Labour candidate, which does seem like a somewhat divisive way of doing it. But I suppose the rule up until now has been that the Labour Party has been fairly ruthless in terms of excluding people it doesn't want on its benches. And it doesn't seem like Keir Starmer wants Diane Abbott on their benches. There has, though, been, I suppose, uniquely when compared to Jeremy Corbyn, for example, people from different wings of the party have been calling for Diane Abbott to be readmitted. I know I've seen sort of John McTernan on Twitter. I think Angela Rayner's actually sort of said that she'd quite like Diane Abbott to get the whip back. So there are lots of people who do seem to think this situation is unfair. Aaron, if you were a betting man, do you think Diane Abbott will be standing in Hackney North, my constituency actually, as a Labour MP?
If I had to bet on it, I would say yes. It doesn't mean I think it's likely, but I think all the things you're saying add up. And again, bear in mind, this is Labour's first black female MP. Would you really want to be the person who is, who deals that final blow to her political career? I mean, I don't think any decent person would. Of course, there are many indecent people in politics, but no. I just don't think that's wise. There are lots of ambitious, unscrupulous people out there, but that really would take the biscuit. It's not like Jeremy Corbyn. She didn't really do, she did something wrong, but, standing for another party or as an independent is, auto expulsion. She's apologised. She's not really a sort of a potential centre of power in Parliament in the way that obviously Corbyn would be as a Labour MP. So no, I think reasonably they should look at her as being an older parliamentarian. She'll probably do one term, maybe two. And, she'll have the issues she's always campaigned on very vociferously. But who knows, Michael? This is the problem with Starmer's people, is that sometimes, they're not reasonable, particularly towards the left. There is a level of enmity and nastiness that actually, from a political, calculative perspective, doesn't make sense. So who knows? But if I had to bet on it, I would say that she'd be the Labour candidate for her constituency.
I wouldn't bet much money on it because it definitely could go either way. But you could see it as sort of a, if they are trying to get a little bit of goodwill, among like the left or among ethnic minority Britons and sort of letting her back in, it could generate a bit of goodwill. And I don't think at this point in time it would generate that many attacks, because I don't think anyone's going to say, oh, Keir Starmer's in the pocket of Diane Abbott, but we'll have to see. Labour's strategy since Keir Starmer was elected leader has been to not commit to, anything. They see policy pledges as vulnerabilities, and so they avoid them. But with a general election underway, they still aren't moving away from that plan and that position. Asked about investment in our sewage system on BBC Question Time, Labour's Bridget Phillipson said this.
We're all going to be on the hook for billions and billions of pounds to increase our infrastructure. Who's going to pay for it?
Well, the water company should have been investing over the decades.
But we are where we are now, so who's going to pay for it?
The water companies need to be held responsible, and water company bosses need to be held responsible for their total failure to invest since privatisation in the infrastructure.
Billions of pounds? Is that what you're saying?
Well, they should have been doing this already. That was the point of privatising.
I'm just trying to work out. I'm not disputing that, but you want to be in power in a couple of months.
Absolutely.
You've got water companies that are going to have to find billions of pounds for infrastructure. You've got Thames Water who's in debt, and their investors saying, well, we're not going to pay. And the government's looking at possible plans to renationalise. Should you be in power, where's the money going to come from?
Well, the water companies need to crack on and make some progress on this.
They need to crack on and make some progress. That wasn't really a plan, was it? She had a critique. She was saying they should have been investing this money for decades, but they want to be in government in about 6 weeks' time. So you need a little bit more than that to say, well, they should have been doing it over the last 20 years. Yeah, but you're now going to be in power. What are you going to do about it? Bridget Phillipson is Labour's shadow education secretary, so that should be, where she really knows her stuff. But on funding for universities, she also struggled with an answer.
How would you help universities get more money?
So from opposition, again, to be totally upfront about this, from opposition, it is genuinely very difficult to grapple.
So you haven't got an answer again. You haven't got an answer again. You're adopting the answer again.
Hang on, let Bridget speak.
Look, it is the modelling around this is really complicated in terms of the outcomes. I am determined that we can deliver a more progressive system without any more spending or borrowing, but from the system that we have at the moment for students.
But as Shadow Education Secretary, Bridget, you must have thought about
out there. You can go and look at where that absolutely can be delivered.
You're Shadow Education Secretary.
Yeah.
If you win the election, I'm assuming you want to be Education Secretary, would you raise tuition fees?
That is a really, really unpalatable choice. I do not want to have to do that. I absolutely don't, because when I speak to students across the country, what they tell me...
No, not going to rule it out, clearly.
The modelling is difficult. That would be a difficult choice. You are going to have to make your mind up soon. Or will they? I was reading, I think it was on Politico, actually. They're saying Labour advisors have been speaking to Joe Biden advisors, and they were said, no, don't commit to anything. Every commitment you make is just something that you can be attacked on. I suppose it's don't interrupt your enemy when they're making a mistake. Everyone hates the Conservative Party. Why would you go out and create a load of talking points where they can say, this will cost this much, this will cost this much, they're going to increase your taxes? It's a small C Conservative strategy where you're sort of saying, let's have as few areas where we can be attacked as possible. But it does end up making them sound a bit shifty, like they haven't really thought about this, because those weren't clear answers to two pretty big issues. Our sewage systems, our education system, what are you going to do? Well, it's fairly complicated. Who's to say? What about the rule of law? So one of the reasons they've been saying we can't say this because there's not enough money, we can't really commit because this is too difficult. Well, the rule of law, sort of committing to it, that shouldn't really cost anything to deliver. So could Phillipson manage anything more concrete on that?
The Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, says Labour's position is that the ICC Chief Prosecutor's decision to apply for arrest warrants is an independent matter for the court. So you're just wait and see what happens. And then presumably, as I say, if this arrest warrant goes ahead and Labour were in power, Labour would arrest the Israeli Prime Minister. So that's the natural sequence of events.
So it's an independent matter for the Chief Prosecutor who was going through that process. It is a formal process that should be gone through. The immediate priority does have to be getting to a ceasefire, getting the release of hostages, getting more aid into Gaza, and alongside that moving towards a two-state solution, a safe and secure Israel alongside a viable Palestinian state.
The question is, should we welcome the intervention from the ICC?
Well, I think the immediate priority has to be getting to a ceasefire.
No, you said that.
Yeah,
Let's answer the question. So should we welcome the intervention from the International Criminal
Court? I think the rule of law matters. I think the international rule of law matters. It used to matter to the Conservative Party as well. It matters to me. There is a process to go through. It's absolutely right that process happens. Okay. If that's what the Chief Prosecutor has determined, but this is only the first step. There has been no conclusion reached on this topic.
But given that Labour is taking a different position, I'm keen to explore it because, as I say, we're in a general election. You may be in power come, second week of July. If this goes ahead through the ICC, and you say you support the ICC and the rule of law, you would be in the position as a government where you would have to arrest Benjamin Netanyahu should he come to this country. Would you do it?
So what you're setting out is a hypothetical scenario where we are a long way from that process.
It's a hypothetical scenario, but it's quite likely to happen. And if you want to be elected to government, we are going to put hypothetical scenarios to you, right? Because the whole point of an election is you want to know what that group of people, what kind of decisions they would make in different scenarios, right? That's normally how a job interview works, actually. They don't just ask you about stuff that's happened in the past. They say, if this were to happen in the future, what would you decide? And it's a very simple question, right? It's not a difficult question, actually. Would you follow through on an arrest warrant by the ICC? And if we're signed up to the Rome Statute, which created the International Criminal Court, it's not a choice. We are legally obligated to arrest anyone who has an arrest warrant out for them if they enter the UK. So that shouldn't have been a difficult question to answer, but it was still just complete blather. Important as well on this one, because you saw in those sort of first two answers that we showed you, the strategy from the Labour Party is to say, look, this is really difficult because the Tories have screwed it up over the past 14 years. We don't really know what to do about tuition fees, but what we can say is the Tories have screwed it up. We don't know what to do about, the sewage system, but what we can say is the Tories and the energy companies or the water companies have screwed it up. When it comes to the International Criminal Court. The Tories haven't screwed that up, right? There's no reason why Labour get into power and say, we've inherited such a difficult situation that we can't carry out the obligations imposed on us by the Rome Statute in the International Criminal Court. You literally have absolute agency on that question. Your hands are not tied. There is no bad past government that has binded your hands so that you can't arrest someone who has an arrest warrant out for them. Obviously, Netanyahu doesn't yet, but if he were to, you would be able to arrest that guy. So I don't know why they can't commit to that. So 6 weeks out from an election, Labour does seem to be struggling with concrete answers on pretty much every question. And one audience member had enough.
I've come to this programme, really want to listen to what Labour Party is going to say. I used to vote for Labour Party, and you've not answered any question at all. See, you've not answered. Look, I know my local MP, Taiwo Watebe. I've spoken. I know her very well. But I just want to hear what Labour Party wants to say about a lot of stuff. Okay. But tonight you've said nothing. You've just given us vague answers. Just answer the question and just convince me to vote for you. Okay. I want you. You know what I mean? Convince me. Tell me how.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. I'm absolutely doing my level best to answer as directly as I can. I think I tried to be really, try to answer as honestly and straightforwardly. So
please make me vote for you.
I hope I've addressed the question around the International Criminal Court. If you want me to set out what Labour would do in education, for example, happy to do that. Breakfast clubs, skills,
can I just say something?
Much more besides mental health support in our schools, more teachers in our classrooms. That we've got an awful lot to say.
I understand that. In 2 months' time, you could be the education secretary.
Yep.
And if I were you, my advice would be, you can actually, it's a political choice. Mm-hmm. You can actually take the education budget and make it an investment instead of, making an expenditure. Why don't you do that? If you make it an investment, as they do in Singapore, in Norway, in Finland, take it away, make it an investment, and that reduces the budget deficit. Mm-hmm. That helps everyone. Invest in education, invest in special education needs, invest in university, do something, Labour Party. Please do.
Okay.
That intervention from that audience member, who put it very well, got a big round of applause, right? We're in the middle of a general election now. The Shadow Education Secretary had not won over the question time audience.
Well, we're not in the middle. They haven't dissolved Parliament. I don't think it's dissolved till the 30th. So we're very much in the foothills, Michael, fortunately.
I accept your correction.
Well, we are, Novara is going to be here to cover all the twists and turns of this general election, Michael. So people should know that we've got lots of treats planned in the weeks ahead. In terms of that performance from Ms. Phillipson on BBC Question Time, look, the whole thing was just absurd. And the whole point of a two-party system has many downsides, right? Has many downsides. It can be not very democratic. You can have a massive incongruence between the percentage of votes a party gets and the number of MPs it gets, for better or worse. You can have the rise of what was called by one lord in the 1980s an elective dictatorship without checks and balances, all these things, blah, blah. The one thing it does is it means that you have two alternatives. They bring forward their policy proposals and their prospectus for power, and the electorate has a choice. And then because of the way that first past the post works, they have a majority to deliver on those promises. And Labour are just doing the complete opposite of what they're meant to do. That is the conventional defence of first past the post and two-party system. And Labour aren't doing that. And so particularly on things like water nationalisation, Michael, look, they don't want to bring water into public ownership. Why? It goes back to that point I said earlier on. They don't want to do anything. It's too hard, right? And I think this is something, again, as you get older, you start to work this out. People at the top of an organisation which is on its arse in their mid-50s, they don't want to fix it. They want to be around just long enough so they can, earn their money, leave, retire, get their pension. Fine. They don't want to fix it. And I think it's the same very much with many elected politicians. It's very rare for a politician to say, I have a vision for this particular thing. I really want to get to the bottom of it and I want to turn it around. It certainly isn't the case with regards to Labour and many things. Utilities here being the example. If you look at water, for instance, Thames Water is probably going to need to be nationalised. They've said, to be fair, they would nationalise that. That's going to require an extraordinary intervention. You have at the same time as that large numbers of former Labour MPs, including Melanie On, former advisors, going to work really in the communications, corporate affairs and lobbying industries, representing clients who are, guess what, water companies. So there is this very common, sadly, relationship between lobbying private interests, privatised utilities and former politicians, very much on the Labour side. Of course, another one was Angela Smith, one of the Change UK people. She got involved in Portsmouth Water, I believe. She's big into privatised water, even though it hasn't really delivered for people. And what I found particularly funny there, Michael, with Bridget Phillipson, was she's saying, well, you know, the government should have done something about it. Water was privatised in the early 1990s. Labour were the government from 1997 to 2010. And the water companies weren't investing then. They were taking out these huge dividends. They were taking huge loans and borrowing those loans against the companies while paying the dividends. So you have, I think, something like 60, 70 billion pounds worth of debt's been placed on these water companies. 70, 80 billion pounds worth of dividends have been taken out. It's the biggest organized heist imaginable in this country. And Labour played a part. Right? Okay, they weren't there when it all started to collapse, which is what's happening right now. The Tories are, but there was two-party consensus for privatised water. They were in charge for 13 years while this was all happening. The point is that the chickens are coming home to roost now, and of course you have to paint that as a distinctly Tory problem. So no, they don't want to fix water because it's going to cost a hell of a lot of money. It's going to make lots of people really upset. Rail is a bit easier, right? But water, even if you bring it into public ownership, you're still going to have to increase bills because nobody's actually maintained the infrastructure properly for 30 years. An amazing statistic I read recently, Michael, I think it was Thames Water, they've only mapped around 50% of the infrastructure they have. 50%. I think they've mapped about 40%. This is in the Financial Times. So how can they be on top of what needs to be fixed and repaired when they don't even know what they have? It's crazy. There's a great quote, you know, you can only manage what you measure. They're not even measuring things. They don't know where stuff is, right? How can you manage this network of water supply and storage if you literally haven't mapped it? These are Victorian maps, which apparently have just been lost. So it is concerning. And it's concerning, like I say, you're breaking with the convention of going to the electorate with your electoral offer, which is what the Labour Party did in 1945. It's what the Tories did in 2019 with Brexit. They said, we'll get Brexit done. We'll get it done. And they kind of did. But it's not happening here. It's just gesturing. Well, the Tories are bad. We won't make any wholesale changes. I get it. You don't want to do that. But what if you have to, right? What if you have to? There's no point digging a hole if it's in the wrong place, right? Some little tweaks and, you know, we won't allow bonuses to go to executives. And that's what they've said before in the water industry. That's not the problem here. The problem is that over the course of 30 years, about 140 billion pounds was basically transferred from public pockets to private pockets. That's the problem. Stopping some CEO getting a 900k bonus in 2025. Okay, I support it. That's not the solution. But of course, again, look, I've said the inertia thing. There's a secondary point here, which is that anything that Labour put in their 29 manifesto, anything associated with the left of the party, is viewed, not just by the Labour establishment, but actually by much of the media too, as necessarily bad. It has to be bad. Jeremy Corbyn pushed it. But what if that's the solution to this problem? What if public ownership of water, rail, mail is the solution to these problems? Well, I think at least we can begin to have an honest conversation about that after the general election. If Labour get in, they do these little fiddling of cufflinks and, you know, just sort of little brushes here and there, a bit of dusting. You do that, it doesn't work. And then let's have a grown-up conversation about public ownership and public investment.
One thing I think we're learning this week is Labour haven't really been tested yet. And while, I mean, there are large parts of the media which, you know, I think feel very warm, essentially, towards Keir Starmer and his front bench, in a general election, they kind of have no choice but to scrutinise Labour. So Labour are going to have to come up over the next 6 weeks. Well, I suppose it's an open question, actually. Do they even have to come up with better questions over the next 6 weeks? Because the Tories are so unpopular. They'll probably win anyway. But I suppose we will see Labour tested in a way that we haven't seen them over the past 5 years. So it will be interesting. And of course, we'll see the Tories tested as well. But I mean, they've been taking flack for a very long time as a completely failing government. Aaron, it's been a very enjoyable first episode with you during this general election, as you say, at the foothills of this general election.
Yeah, Michael, don't you mislead our wonderful audience. We've got so much to let people know about next week, how we're going to cover this general election. I'm very excited. But before then, I hope you and everybody watching and listening have a wonderful restorative weekend.
Yes, do have a wonderful restorative weekend. There's also a bank holiday this Monday, isn't there? We are going to be still doing a Novara Live, but if you do have the day off, have a great extended weekend. Come back on Monday, of course. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.